All right, YouTube, I'm sure that those of you who are more into politics, especially the sort of darker underbelly of internet politics, are aware of the existence of AIDS, Skrillex, and Carl the Cuck. Um, Difficult to even say these titles without bursting out laughing. Uh, some people are really upset. They're like, "Oh, well, it's not okay to make fun of these people for the way that they look, even if the reason why they look crazy is because they're doing like the Bill Cosby facial mugging and pretending to be really offended by other people occasionally using common sense, ganging up on, I guess, a Trump supporter. The backstory is a Trump supporter goes into sort of a crowd of protesters, starts asking people specifically why they think the way that they do. And these people are essentially nothing more than dismissive of the questions asked or of the statements made. And instead of actually providing what you would consider a reasonable, a sane counterargument, they act incredulous. They act like they can't believe that somebody would disagree with them. This is the sort of hive mind mentality that you see both in right wing and left wing rallies to some extent. You see it more among the younger population that is less, in some cases, less politically literate, doesn't really understand history, doesn't really understand much of anything. Many of these people at these protests, they're not studying political science, they're not studying history, they're not studying economics or something like that. A lot of these people are probably Holocaust studies, women's studies majors, art school students, liberal arts, and there's nothing there's nothing particularly wrong with somebody studying, getting a degree in women's studies or something like that. The problem is that does not qualify you just because you have an education as a sum total, you happen to have a degree or be seeking a degree and passing your courses, doesn't necessarily mean you know what you're talking about. It would be like somebody who goes to college and studies like anthropology, which is what I studied, then claiming that this makes them an expert in nuclear physics. Obviously, that doesn't work. Just because somebody's good in one field or understands something from one field doesn't necessarily mean that they've studied anything at all in any other field. The problem, though, goes deeper than that. The problem with the social justice warrior fringe of the, you could call it liberal movement, it's gone way, it's no longer even really a liberal movement, it's not even a progressive movement at this point, it's just a bunch of socialists for the most part. Socialists and authoritarians, which in many cases don't realize that they're statists and authoritarians. The problem is that these people, first, they don't recognize that their ideology is not shared even by a majority of people within the political party they tend to support. And paired with that would be they don't understand that the political party that they generally support doesn't really have time or inclination to take their claims seriously. It will throw them a few crumbs now and then. Ultimately, they don't really care about it. The alt-right has, in some instances, some alt-right individuals, not all, not like Ramsey Paul and a few others, but some of them have made the same mistake. They think that the right wing has actually, at least part of the right wing has supported their ideology, when really all the mainstream Republicans have done is take this same watered-down centrist, vaguely authoritarian approach that the Democrats take. And oftentimes they've come to understand this. That a person like Mitt Romney, really, they're about the same as Obama. They're about the same as Hillary Clinton. Most of these people, they're part of the same club. They argue against one another. They pretend to hate each other. Then they go out for drinks. The social justice warriors and some of the more severe alt-right individuals, including, and I would say as well, certain libertarians, not myself, but others, seem to have this weird fascination with the concept that there's actually a difference at this point between the two parties. The reason why Trump is being opposed, for instance, by his own party is specifically because his views happen to be different from that mainstream, which crosses over the two parties. Bernie Sanders has the same issue. He's not taken seriously by the DNC for the same reasons. Now, I say that just because the corrupted centrist authoritarians crossing over between the two parties are bad doesn't mean that anybody who's necessarily outside of that happy club of wine-swilling millionaires has good ideas. For instance, I look at Bernie Sanders and I've said I'm not feeling the burn. I'm not a supporter of Sanders, specifically because he wants to screw my wallet. Just because he is admittedly a grassroots candidate who is outside of that sort of centrist club, because he doesn't have the Goldman Sachs donors, doesn't mean his ideas are any better than theirs. I would look at Trump and I would say many of his ideas are better. Not all, but many of them. And I would say for a third party, someone like Gary Johnson appeals much more to me. The other problem that the social justice warriors here appear to have is that they're simply incapable of making their point without dragging in the same sort of arguments that they would stereotype somebody from the Ku Klux Klan or a group like that for making. That is, if you look at what these people are saying, the essential argument that they're making against those who happen not to agree with them, that Trump is Hitler or something like that, and Hitler is the most overused term since Napoleon, or Charles Manson certainly. Their essential argument to these individuals boils down to, I can't understand why you would disagree with me because my point of view is self-evident. This is the same exact mistake. I've made so many parallels between today's social justice warriors and yesterday's Evangelo-Con Zionists that at this point I am convinced that they are functioning as the same thing. That is, in the satanic panic sort of era, the Christians there, who, arguably some of their leaders were just making money and weren't even Christians. They were led by a bunch of morons like Billy Graham. These people assumed first and foremost that the fact that the majority of the country was Christian meant that the majority of the country supported televangelism and witch hunts. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was that anyone with even slight amounts of intellectual capacity would look at a debate between somebody within this moralist movement, and the social justice warriors are just a different type of moralist, by the way. They're exactly the same. They would look at the argument that they make and look at the rebuttal made by anyone who knew about heavy metal or about the occult or about something outside of Judeo-Christianity. And any unbiased third-party individual just witnessing that would generally side with the occultist, with the Satanist, with the Wiccan or whatever. Why? Because the arguments that were being made claimed that they were self-evident, but when times change, arguments formerly classed as self-evident amongst the mainstream population, where even the fringe can get away with saying lunatic shit, because a lot of people agree with that lunatic shit. They no longer have that capability. Times change, and their views are then seen as completely outdated. For instance, you look back, I've seen plenty of Christian individuals. I host, for example, the sort of Bob Larson interview of Nicholas and Zena Shrek. At the time when that was aired, the majority of the population watching that thought, these satanic people are creepy, they sound crazy and genocidal, they sound like loonies, and Bob Larson, while not perfect in many people's opinions, I'm sure, represents more what we believe in. He represents Jesus. Now, though, looking back, a lot of the Christians say, well, it seems like the Dark Ages. Well, that wasn't that long ago. That was in the early 1990s that second interview took place, I believe. I believe it was 1992. So looking back in retrospect, even people that would have had no problem with the crazy things that were being said by what was supposedly a mainstream individual at the time, or closer to the mainstream, now they seem lunatic by comparison. The same will happen, by the way, to these social justice warriors. Most of them, they can't formulate a proper argument specifically because they claim self-evidence in what they believe. Now, as to the question of whether they're moralists or not, and I say, of course, yes, they are. The social justice warriors are nothing more than moralists who have taken up what most people would consider to be a progressive line of reasoning, as opposed to the traditionalist line of reasoning used by moralists in times past. They would say, for example, in the 1980s, during the Satanic Panic up until the early 90s, somebody would say, well, it's obvious that homosexuality or heavy metal or not worshiping Jesus are bad things. Bad people do them. They shouldn't be tolerated. By the way, we should pass a bunch of laws against such things. We should give the government more power. They were statists. They were moralists. They said we should use the power of the government as a cudgel against those who don't agree as we do. In the modern sense, the social justice warrior does exactly the same thing. If somebody doesn't agree with this, that, and the other thing, or hates this particular politician, or disagrees with my point of view, they are a racist, bigot, xenophobe, horrible Nazi worshipping Hitler. And by the way, we should pass laws against hate speech, which doesn't exist. There's no such thing as hate speech, folks. It doesn't even exist. It's just a newspeak term to describe opinions which happen to seem inappropriate to the left mainstream, as you could term it. And you will find the reason why you know that it's newspeak, and you know that it's fated to eventually be doomed, and people will look back on this period, and people, I guess the alt-right can take heart in this. The reason why you know that this is doomed is it's an exact doppelganger of what happened during the Satanic Panic, or in many of the other moral panics of the past. The new moral panic is white people are all racist, men are all sexist, everyone's homophobic and xenophobic, and if you don't love immigrants, then you're a bad person, and borders are evil, and things like that. It's a moral panic. You look at anything that's been written in the last couple of years from Salon or Jezebel or Being Liberal or any of these other whack job pages, and they will try to convince you that we're in the middle of a major gun crime epidemic, despite gun crime being at a 40-year low in our country. They will try to tell you that the Klan is everywhere, Nazis are everywhere, everybody just wants to kill all black people, even though hate group activity has been slacking off now for several decades at a rather quick clip. Most people they don't feel that strongly about these issues anymore. They will try to tell you that bigotry and xenophobia are everywhere. The only thing that they can base that on is the fact that a lot of people in this country, including a lot of legal immigrants in this country, are tired of politicians not doing anything about the border crisis. It doesn't even have to do with race. They wouldn't want 1 million illegals from Eastern Europe entering the country any more than they would 1 million illegals from Central America, honestly. I've stated my opposition to the concept of mass deportation on an economic and constitutional basis, but I don't honestly blame a lot of people for supporting the concept, because the politicians and the people propping up the concept that it's evil, most often they won't do what I'll do. What I would do is say, it will be expensive. I don't think that it can be reasonably paid for. It may be ineffective, and if it's not ineffective, the only reason it won't be is because the Fourth Amendment has been fundamentally suspended in all of the border states. That's why I'm opposed to it. But they don't say that. They don't go into reasons or sane details of why they oppose it. Their opposition comes from, it's evil, it's racist, it's xenophobic and bigoted. How can you possibly want to force people out of the country? Borders are evil. Never Trump, 2016. That's what their argument boils down to. I would point this out as well. The label cuck-servative envisioned by the alt-right really does stick to somebody like Ted Cruz. You would think of somebody who pretends to be a moral traditionalist in sort of the Satanic Panic era. I mean, he's a total evangelical nut job for the most part. And yet at the end of the day, he talks about how somehow these proposals that have been put in place, that some of which could arguably work very well, like actually finishing the border wall that was started so many decades ago. And he'll call you a bigot too and say, well, that's not a way forward for our political party. Well, screw your political party. Nobody cares. A growing majority of Americans don't even identify with a political party anymore. Both of the parties have suffered from the same fate since around 2010, when people began to realize that Obama and Bush were basically the same thing. Well, since the parties continue to offer these stupid idiots that don't really know what they're doing, that have no intention of fulfilling any of their campaign promises, what's the point of voting for these two parties? And I predict that third-party membership, again, as it has for the last two cycles, is going to continue to rise. This, too, by the way, bothers this same social justice warrior fringe as much as it bothers the moralists. This is why I consider myself, generally speaking, to be a libertarian. I noticed the far right, sort of the Ted Cruzes of the world and so forth, as well as the corporate right, the Mitt Romneys, and the corporate left, like the Hillarys, and the far left, like Sanders or Carl the Cuck, or any of these people, they all get equally confused about what libertarianism actually is. Somebody on the right thinks that it's some weird far left version of anarchism. People on the left think that we're just Republicans who want to smoke weed or something. They don't really know what libertarianism is because all of the media outlets they happen to like, which trust in the media is shrinking too at a relatively rapid pace, have convinced them that it's something that it's actually not. It's just government should be constrained because it's fairly self-evident. Now, you can make that self-evident claim on a constitutional basis. Nobody has to listen to you, but you can say, well, that's kind of the purpose of the Constitution. Seems to work, generally speaking, although it probably should be expanded. I don't look at immigrants or even illegal immigrants and say, well, I hate these fucking illegals, get them out of the country. I say if somebody has committed a crime while they're here, certainly, of course, they should be deported, and they should never return to this country. I think there's going to be quite a bit of public debate over what to do with the remaining pool of roughly 9 million illegals. Jury is still out on which direction this country will choose to go. But the far left, generally speaking, is just making the same mistakes that the far right did back in the 80s. You can't even call them really far left and far right. They're just moralists. The far left of today, as you may term it, is actually, in a way, also a traditionalist movement. They simply define and interpret American traditionalism as something that is not necessarily ideologically in step with what I think the founders honestly had in mind. The concept of a borderless society in which, all the only guns you can own are like flintlock muskets or something. I don't think that's what they had in mind. I think most people in the mainstream understand this. By the way, the fringe of the left are the people conducting these protests. They seem more massive than they really are. Their support level is not actually particularly high. It's just the squeaky wheel gets the oil in all cases. Just like the worst of the right wing were the ones that got on the news during the Tea Party uprising in 2010, which was lucrative for the RNC until they went rogue, by the way, which is really funny to watch them suffer. They deserved it. I mean, after Bush, they honestly did deserve it. They took back the House, but they did deserve to suffer as well for their lack of foresight and pragmatism and for their shutting down of Ron Paul because he wanted to take away their free money from the Fed. If you look, though, a very small number of very dedicated, very loud people can get a lot more attention than a very large group of relatively calm individuals. We saw this, again, as well in the Satanic Panic. You would think of people like Bob Larson, people who go and ran about fire and brimstone constantly with a, relatively large audience. They're the ones that got listened to on the subject. They also tended to be the ones that were very greedy and just wanted to make money and were bought off. Or they didn't really know what they were talking about, they just happened to be well-spoken, so people listened to them if they were superstitious. The far left is the same. The Al Sharptons of the world don't really represent even liberalism, they just represent the victim mentality that happens to be reigning within their circles currently. They're also on their way out. Much like the evangelical era ended, when it seemed evangelism was at its strongest because it was complaining loudest. They made the same mistake that the social justice warriors are currently making. They are disenfranchising their name with the mainstream of the population. They're probably about to massively lose the election. I think Donald Trump is almost certain to be the next U.S. president. They're not going to continue getting their way. For a while, they'll be very, very upset about this, and they'll continue to protest. After a while, when the moon doesn't fall out of orbit, and the stars don't fall from the sky, and Satan doesn't crawl up out of the ground and start raping people with his 10-foot porcupine cock, they will realize, oh, well, I guess I was worried in many cases about nothing, and it'll go back to the way that it was. Could be wrong, but traditionally that's what's happened over the last few cycles. In fact, I think many of these people will become the next sort of Reagan youth. They'll become yuppies. What will end up happening is once they see what Trump actually believes in, and I've made it clear, I'm voting for Gary Johnson, but I fully expect Trump to be the next president. I think he's going to win fairly handily. Hillary doesn't really stand that much of a chance. What's going to happen is that combined ability to negotiate with the charisma, and especially with the fact that most people don't really know what he's about and are completely confused by him and will be until the general election begins for the most part, I think will secure him the nomination and the general. And when he actually gets into office and people realize he's not starting the Third World War, a lot of those people that complained loud and long will perceive there as being no fundamental difference and jump aboard with the Trump train for his re-election should he choose to seek it. It's basically, again, Ronald Reagan 2.0. And as for the polling, ignore it at this point. Ignore the polls of Trump versus Hillary. They haven't debated yet. They haven't really done much towards one another yet because they're too busy securing their nominations. We saw in the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan was behind Jimmy Carter by double digits for the majority of the general election, too, until the final debate when suddenly people realized how weak, tired, and shitty Jimmy Carter was. No offense to Jimmy Carter because he gets a lot of flack for things he himself was not fundamentally responsible for. But he was leading in the polls by a wide margin until the final debate. Ronald Reagan completely eclipsed him and destroyed him in a landslide. He then did the same to Walter Mondale. People could look back through relatively modern political history. It would take you a few hours to fully research many of these races and know what you're talking about. And they would understand why Trump is so likely to win. Most people still are clinging to this delusion that he has no chance because he happens to be unpopular at the moment. But when you look at the constant haranguing, the constant incorrect predictions that have been made by every pundit, by everybody within the media, by everyone within politics, very few of us fairly early on realized that Trump was going to remain the front runner. At first, I thought the same as anyone else. I thought, well, he'll probably drop back out because he's probably doing this. He might be pitching a TV show or something. When it became clear he was actually the front runner and was staying in, and the media was completely fixated on him, I said, no, you don't understand. He's now not only the front runner, but likely to remain the front runner. Ben Carson came and went, Fiorina came and went, everyone came and went. And that's what I predict is going to continue. The left will be very, very vicious. You have to realize, the Soroses and so forth of the world, they probably will conduct violent attacks as Trump continues to churn forward. Once he clinches the nomination, it will come to a head. It will quiet back down for a while, and then in the general, they will continue to do the same thing. They will attack him verbally on the media, of course. They will attack his rallies. They will try to disrupt things. You'll probably see violence. Ultimately, though, it's not going to make that big a difference. We've seen this before, by the way, in American politics. We've had people before who have dueled within our political system, who have beaten one another with fireplace tongs and things of that nature. This is a dirty election, yes, certainly more fun than the last few elections where it was difficult if you closed your eyes to tell which candidate was speaking. Mitt Romney and Obama, they're basically exactly the same. But Carl the Cuck and Skrillex really represent the stupidity of the modern social justice warrior movement, which cannot formulate an argument that doesn't include that aspect of feigned self-evidence. The problem being anyone on the fence doesn't see their argument as self-evident. They don't see, well, you're racist because you're white as a sensible argument. They spend all day talking to one another, talking to people they already agree with. And the way they refine their argument is not by going after people that actually oppose them. They talk in terms of stereotypes and anecdotes to other people who they already agree with ideologically on many issues. And so as a result, they're at a loss. They can't debate their way out of a paper bag. They don't know anything about economics. They don't know anything about political history for the most part. And that's their mistake. It's the same mistake that the fucking moralists made in the 1980s and 1990s. It's the same mistake they're making now. They are doomed. By the way, Ted Cruz is doomed. He won't be the nominee. Kasich is doomed. Rubio won't be the nominee. That's one final thing here that I will point out really quick. In the Republican convention rules, the only two people who will be on the second ballot are Trump and Cruz, because they're the only ones that have won more than 8 states. Kasich, do you think that Kasich's going to win 7 more states? No, he's not. He probably won't win 1 more state. If it is, it'll be Indiana, and that's probably all he'll get. The only 2 people that'll be on that second ballot are the people in the best position to claim the nomination. Trump will be the nominee, because all those Kasich and Rubio delegates, once they're unbound on a second ballot, and that's assuming Trump doesn't get to the 1237, which I think it's a 50-50 proposition. Even if he doesn't, though, all those people, they're going to vote for the person who has the most votes already. They're going to vote for Donald Trump. They're not going to vote for Ted Cruz. Ultimately, when it comes to electability, there's really no contest. They don't really want to commit suicide as a party, and these delegates are not the same as the pundits or the heads of the RNC. These delegates, in many cases, are working in the fashion of a representative at some lower, like municipal level or something, because they sought nomination to become a delegate in the first place. These are people that are already in politics. They don't want to lose their jobs. They want to see the GOP completely dissolved. They'll vote for Trump. That's my prediction. That's about all. Peace out.